Hi, this is Darren of The Draw on Zazzle.com and elsewhere. In this video, we are going to be doing an overview of the Gather Round Kwanzaa Creations Kit, which is a collection of items, each of which has over 80 images that you can use as you wish, display, or hide as you wish, to customize, to personalize, to truly create your own unique item for Kwanzaa. You know, something that will really hold special meaning and significance for you and your family for Kwanzaa. Of course, there's links in the description to the collection itself, to a catalog of images available, and all that. But let's go ahead and get started. So we have here the Zazzle homepage. Every couple days they kind of change what they show here or offer here. It's not really important for our purposes. So let's go ahead and go to my store's homepage. Now, I can't always guarantee that the Kwanzaa Creations Kit will be right here on front. I can't even guarantee I'll always have collections right here on front. But no worries, you can always just go up here to collections, or again, follow the link in the description or whatnot. But let's go ahead and go into the collection. Now, I did set up default versions of all of the items, even though, again, the idea is to gather your family around the computer and, truly create something unique. And partly I did that so that the images would all be pre-formatted, to be more convenient to work with, but also to help illustrate, all of the possibilities of what you can do with the images. So just scrolling through here, you might see that there is quite a bit of variety. But you could, for instance, do a table setting. Something like this, and of course you have all the symbols on the table. You have even a poster of the Nguzo Saba, and you might notice the wall is gray, the tablecloth on the table is green. Of course, we have a draped bandera here for additional adornment. On the other hand, here for instance, we still have a table setting, but now you might notice the wall is more of a fuchsia color, the tablecloth is gold. There's this Kente spread based on an original Kente pattern I did for the collection. And you might see this is the same kinara as the last item, but on the other hand, here we have a different kinara. You might notice now the background is not a wall at all. Technically, it's more of an abstract image. The tablecloth is red. In fact, there's 5 different wall colors, 5 different tablecloth colors, a handful of images for backgrounds other than the walls. Different, variations on the symbols and all that. So you can do, quite a few different table settings. Or you could do some type of pattern. For instance, like the shirt, again, this is an original Kente pattern that I drew for the collection and is available on all of the images, all of the items, just like, all the other images. So you can do something like that, or for instance, this necktie by default. This is actually just a bandera rotated 45 degrees and tiled so that it fills up the length of the tie. And you might notice here there's both the front and the back design area. The back actually has a slightly different pattern to it than the front. Or something like these drop earrings. Now you could do something like that. And you can do something that focuses on a principle or a symbol. So for instance, like these stickers here, 2 Kikombe Cha Umojas crossed with Umoja in gold. And that's actually the gray wall back there. Yeah, fairly simple, but kind of nice. Or for instance, this clock. So here, by default, this is featuring Mazao and Ujima. And as you can see, there's some text expressing a sentiment that kind of not only ties those two together, but kind of ties it all in with the item itself. So you always have the option to add your own text, your own messages, your own sentiments to items. Or you can do something that focuses on your family or honors an ancestor. So for instance, this plate, you could put a photo of a revered ancestor and of course their name, and just a simple sentiment to, make you think of them, remind everybody of them, to honor them. something like that. Or you can feature your children, with something like this. You can put photos of your children and of a boonsie, in association with each one. Something like that. Of course, you can do something that, features, celebrated or, revered leaders, civil rights activists or otherwise. So this pillow, for instance, we have some pretty famous and respected people on front. It's an Mkeka background back there. Of course, another item with, front and back. So on the back we're using the bandera, so we have a different background, some more people. You can do something like that, or something like this t-shirt is by default. And this t-shirt actually has, I believe, that on front has a table setting on back. So again, when there's more than one design area to an item, you can design those independently. Or you could do something that highlights a practice of Kwanzaa. So let's see. Well, of course, you can always do a Nguzo Saba poster. And again, this is strictly the default version I have, set up. If you want to customize it, certainly you're encouraged to do that. If you would want to do a poster with something else entirely, you could get rid of all this and do that. But of course, that's just, something you could do for a poster that would be fairly common. Or, let's see, like these Tambiko placemats. And this is actually the libation statement as used by the Imani Foundation. I believe it is pretty close to the official libation statement, but either way, you could, of course, use your own libation statement, or again, you could get rid of that entirely and design something else. But yeah, you could do something like that. And let's see. Of course, you can always set up items for the 6th night, for the Karamu, or for the celebration. For instance, something like these plates. So we have, family and music and dance and stories and share and feast, Karamu and Harambe and all that. You can do something like that. Here, something like these napkins, or even something like this platter. So here now you can have a photo, for instance, of your family and kind of have some words to tie all that in. You could do something like that for serving. So, yeah, I think that as you can see that there is quite a bit of variety of things that you can, design with the collection, with the kit. So let's go ahead and get into basic customizing, how we would actually go about doing all of that. So if you go to an items page, so for instance this tile here, and go up to customize, that should bring you into the design interface, as you see here. Now, as for the basics, the first thing, of course, I might point out is the images are all available in a list over here on the right. And if the item only has one design area, there will only be one list. But if there are more design areas, you can collapse down one list and then there will be other ones corresponding to each, side or design area. And you might notice these eye icons that appear next to every image. These let you show or hide the image in question. So this is the real core of how you get the images you actually want to work with on an item to go from there. So say, for instance, this Kikombe Cha Umoja, you decided you didn't want that one on here. You just click the eye icon, and there it is, gone. You could, for instance, swap in this one if you wanted, or of course you could go back if you decided you wanted the original one. And of course you can always click and drag an image in the design area to move it around, in the interface to move it around. You can also use these arrow buttons down here to move things if you wish. It kind of depends to some extent if you want to try to be real precise and really measure things out, or just kind of be free form about it. It could just be simpler in some cases just to click and drag. But anyway, so that really is the basics of it right there. So for instance, if you wanted to try a different Kinara, you could get that one out of there. You could go ahead and swap in a different one. Or you could, there's, for instance, there's 4 different forms in the Zao. You could go ahead and change out to different things there. You could, alter which of the Zawadi between these two books that lie flat, the standing book here and the djembe. You could, swap out what you wanted with that. You have a couple choices for the mkeka on the table. Just a lot of different choices of things that you can, just swap in or out. And that's really the basics of it. But let's say you wanted to do something a little more advanced than that, or say you wanted to have a table setting on an item which by default did not have a table setting. For instance, let's say you wanted the table setting on this clock. So the first thing to do would be to get rid of all the things that you didn't want, which of course you could go to start hiding them, or you do actually have the option to delete images or text. If you go to the arrow next to the eye icon on a given image, it'll ask you if you're sure you want to remove something. You can hit remove. You are able to use the undo feature to bring images and text back. However, depending on how many changes you may make before you would decide you want to do that, at the very least it could be inconvenient to have to sequentially undo everything you've done. And I can't guarantee how far back you would be able to go. So I don't really recommend that you try deleting images unless you're certain that you don't want them, because otherwise your only option would be to start over with the item, with customizing the item. But anyway, so let's go ahead and go through here and get rid of these images that we presumably don't want. So say you're trying to design a table setting. Let's go ahead and pick a wall, let's say, and maybe go up here and pick a table, say that. Of course, you could have the Kente spread if you wanted or not. You could do one of the draped bandera. Now, one very important thing, somewhat advanced but also still pretty basic, one very important thing I should point out, images that appear higher in the list will cover ones that appear lower, even if the ones that are lower are marked to be visible. So here, for instance, you might see the mkeka is on top of the draped bandera, which is on top of the Kente spread, which is on top of the table, which is a direct reflection of the order that these images appear in. And you might see, for instance, this mkeka appears above this one. Of course, they're placed in the same spots. So if you make this one visible, now, even though this bottom one is in fact still visible, you actually can't see it because it's being covered by the one on top. So that is, to help avoid frustration or, trying to get things to appear visually correct. That's very important to be aware of. And I tried to have everything in a default order that was most convenient. Certainly, I put backgrounds all at the bottom and put items like higher up and try to get it in a way that you won't have to move things around too much. But, you do have to watch out that you may need to do that. For instance, let's say we go ahead and select the Kinara for now. Now say you wanted to put this Mazao and you decided you wanted to have the standing book or the leaning book leaning against it. So you say you go to move this over, and the first thing you might notice, it appears now as though the Kinara is somehow sitting on top of the basket, although it's not, it's flat though, which doesn't really quite make sense. So this just doesn't really look natural and you would want to do something about that. But a bigger problem you might even have, say you go ahead and drag the standing book over here. Instead of leaning against the basket, it's as if it's somehow behind it, which again, that doesn't even really make sense. But that just comes down to, again, the order of the images. So in this case, for instance, you could go ahead and drag this book above the Mazao. And there you go. So now you could just go ahead and tweak this, try to get it so it's, say contained on the table but leaning against the basket. And as for the Kinara, again, that really doesn't look the best, but we could just go up here and click it and drag it down below the Mazao. Now it's appearing behind it, so therefore it's appearing as though the Mazao on the basket is in front of the Kinara, perhaps resting on it slightly. And that, all looks okay. So again, you just need to keep that in mind, that you may need to reorder images to help get the effects that you want, or to clear up things that don't visually look right. And you can always shrink or expand images. So go down here to scale. either, bigger or smaller. For instance, this Kinara, if you thought that looked a little bit too big, you could shrink that down maybe a couple times. Of course, now it's not really centered on the table. You could just go ahead and drag it back down in place. Or, as I said, you can always use these arrow keys if you want to be more precise about your movements. You can even, if you go here to shortcuts, depending on how big you are on keyboard shortcuts, you might find use for some of these, but what I want to point out here is smaller moves, Alt, and the arrow keys. So it might depend on your operating system. On a Macintosh, I actually use the Command key for that, but they're saying Alt key here. What you can do is you can hold down whichever key, and then when you go to click the arrows, you might notice the item moves at the image moves at a much smaller distance. So that might be good for fine-tuning. If you really want fine-tuning, you can even go and just click and just ever so slightly drag. Well, that may have been even too much. For instance, if you're trying to get an MKK like as close to perfectly centered as possible on the table, you might need to do that or whatnot. But yeah, so you can expand or shrink images. You can actually rotate images, which, let's go ahead and start putting all of these Vabunzi up. As you might see, there are 3 basic forms of the Vabunzi. Each one has a mirrored form, and then there's 2 copies of all that. So there's 12 Vabunzi altogether. And of course, as I was going through setting up the default items, even if a table setting was not already on, or was not meant to be on the item in the end, I still set one up, which is partly why the images are fairly pre-configured to work for a table. To that end, you usually will find that there are 2 Vabunzi that appear down here somewhere around the table. But say, maybe you don't want this red one, you'd rather have a yellow one. You can just go ahead and, grab whatever one you want. And here again, we're seeing that there's a bit of a conflict between the default ordering of the images. This Vabunzi is clearly in front, but yet this one that's in back is somehow showing up in front of it. So if you click an image, it should highlight where it is over in the list, or vice versa. If you click something over here, it should show you, where the image is over here. It should highlight it. This yellow one is way down here. This blue one is way up there. So again, we could go ahead and drag that up higher than the blue one to fix that and whatnot. But like I said, you also have the option to rotate images. So say, for instance, for the Vabunzi, you didn't want them to just be lying flat or horizontal like that. You wanted them to appear as though they were slightly angled on the table. So highlight the image, go to rotate, and for this, maybe we'll do something small, like 15 degrees. But as you can see, you can rotate an image. You can even have that as though it's resting up on the edge of the Kinara. And of course, you can also do negative numbers to rotate the other way. And I always get a little mixed up myself as to whether the positive or negative corresponds to clockwise or counterclockwise rotations, but it's very easy to change. And I believe you can put as high of numbers in here as you want, and Zazzle will just automatically bring it down to within a certain range, So that's, that's all fairly straightforward. Yeah, so that's kind of the basics. I mean, to finish off a table setting, of course, you'd go ahead and pick your Kikomi Chao Moja, and I think that might be, is that the only symbol that's missing off here so far? Let's see. Yeah, in fact, let's go ahead and add that. I think that's the only of the major symbols, the primary symbols that's missing. Let's say we do something like that. I don't know. So yeah, of course, then you go and hide all the Vabunzi and all that. But let's say, though, that you were wanting to design a pattern. Let's go ahead and look at this. A few other features here in the design interface work particularly well for that. So first thing I should point out, if you select an image and go down to More, Tile this image, gives you the option to tile it so that it fills the whole item, the whole design interface. So you can certainly do that for these Kente patterns. And of course, you can always scale an image. You can shrink or expand it. So here, for instance, if you thought that maybe this, the individual panels of the pattern were a little bit too big, you could go ahead and start scaling down that, get something like that. You can scale it up. Of course, as you just saw, you can scale while the image is tiled if you wish to or not. That's up to you. Now, you might notice, or might have noticed, these fill and fit buttons down here. You might be wondering what those are. In fact, let's demonstrate that on this. Fit will expand or contract. I guess if the image is already very big, it would contract. But it will make an image fill the design area without, going beyond it. So, for instance, fit. As you can see then that this Kente pattern is expanded so that it's within the borders of the design area, but it's not exceeding it. Well, except for these two little corners, because the image, of course here, because the image is rectangular and this item, the design area, doesn't conform to that, there would be a couple parts here that would get cut off. If you bring it down, you could avoid that. But yeah, and it centers the image as well. Fill, on the other hand, will center and expand an image to the point that it completely fills the design area, even if that means cropping off parts of the image. So for backgrounds in particular, you're very often going to want to use fill. For instance, if this image at some point were smaller, go to fill, expand it, fill the whole background. Same thing for these bandera. They're already fully expanded to, fill all of it. Or I should point out that if you do not wish to use a background image, you always have the option to go down here and select a color. Presumably these are popular colors that Zazzle has, or if you go down to the color picker, you can choose from literally thousands, if not millions, of colors. Yeah, so you can play around with that. Adjust the hue down here, adjust saturation and lightness by clicking in different parts up here. Or if you don't want a background color, just select transparent here and get rid of that. But yeah. And although I did, well, and I should point out, of course, some certain patterns. This one, for instance, as you see, if it's really shrunk down like this, you get, by tiling it, you get this distinct pattern. If you were to expand it all of the way to fill it, you get something different. So you can keep that in mind. And although I didn't do it by default for any of the items, you do have the option, for instance, to crop an image. So in particular for patterns, you might find that by cropping an image, you can achieve a pattern that is a little bit distinct from, what is immediately available. So for instance, go ahead and click check mark to OK that change. If you now go to tile this, you get a distinct pattern that was not available as the images were originally. So like I said, I did not do that by default for any of the images or on any of the items, but that is an option available to you. And you might notice, I should mention this filter button. You do have the option to apply filters to your images. I don't know that any of these, really fit for the items, but that's, up to you what you think. There is the option here to apply filters. In addition to tiling, I should point out too as well, there are these patterns you can try. I can't say myself I found these to be particularly applicable, but again, they are down here. You can try some of these different things to get some different patterns. But let's say, let's say that, so every image, most images are only, maybe appear twice at most, or only once in the list, which of course puts some limit on creativity, but say that you wanted more copies of the images. Amazingly enough, it is possible. If you go to shortcuts, look way down here to duplicate. You actually have the option to highlight an image, hold down the key, the appropriate key, and drag it and create a duplicate. This is saying Alt. On a Macintosh, that's Option, although it does have Alt smaller up in the corner. But anyway, so let's say, for instance, with this bandera, let's first go ahead and put it back to 0 rotation, put it back horizontal. We'll go ahead and fit it just for the sake of cutting out some of the shrinkings we have to do to scale it down. Let's say our end goal would be to have a stripe essentially kind of cutting diagonally across this shirt. So let's see. we might want to put that extending a little bit beyond the edge there, because when it's diagonal, it's going to need to be a little bit longer. So let's do that. So hold down the appropriate key, click and drag. And there it is, a duplicate image, which if you need to move it around at all should be deposited at the very top. But if not, let's go ahead and create a few more duplicates. Perhaps 4 is enough. Let's see, just have that overlap slightly. Of course, you might notice these are not positioned very properly, but that's no problem. In fact, we're going to get to that right now. Whichever key you would use for your operating system to highlight multiple items, you can do that. You can select multiple images here. And if you look down here to align layers, you can align, for instance, along a horizontal line. We do that. There we go. These are all perfectly smoothed over and lined up now. And let's see. I do have to say I expected that it would let me rotate as a group, and apparently it's graying that out. It doesn't want to allow that. Well, in that case, if you wanted to do the horizontal or the diagonal line as we were talking about, you could just go in and rotate all of these. But now you would have to attempt to manually position these, which you can do. If you go up here to Gridlines, you can turn on, Gridlines for better positioning. You can even get rid of the guidelines temporarily to kind of take some of that, darker color away. So you could do something like that, and, start aligning these. If you took enough time to try to get these all matched up by hand, even though it would be a little bit more tedious, I'm sure you would be able to accomplish it, and you could, achieve something like that. So, anyway, so you do have the option to create duplicates of images. You can crop images down, especially to help you create different types of patterns and whatnot. But moving on, as I said earlier, you always have the option to add custom text to an item, to a design. You can do that. Just go up to add text up here. Just go ahead and type in, whatever you want. If you don't want it, you don't like what you typed, get rid of it with the X or the check mark. Go ahead and approve it. It will appear right here on top, and you can work with it just like an image. You can drag it around, you can move it around, you can scale it. You can do all of that. But in addition to that, you have some other options for text. You can edit existing text. You can go down here to edit if you want to change something. You can select from several different fonts, especially if you go here to all fonts. You can see the complete list and even see what they would appear like. And there really are quite a few of them. I think Zazzle more than once has added new ones even. So quite a bit to look through and pick from. But yeah, different fonts. You can, of course, set the size of the text, adjust the size of the text. And, of course, this is directly connected with scaling the text. You can scale it as though it's an image. If you do that, it will change the size. Or you can directly change the size. That's kind of two different ways to achieve the same effect. You can select a whole bunch of different colors for your text. Again, you can pick a suggested color up here, or you can go into the color picker, select a different saturation and lightness, adjust the hue down here. You can do all of that. Or you can change text alignment, left, center, or right. For instance, here you might notice, of course, on this mug by default, we have the Nguzo Saba and a table setting. And each principle, depending on which of the Mishuma or candles it corresponds to, is either left aligned, or if it corresponds to a right candle, it's right aligned, or Umoja, corresponding to the center candle, is centered. So, you might find different uses for the different alignments of text. You can always make vertical or curved text if you wish. In fact, we saw earlier on the clock, I believe, and on the ancestor porcelain plate, how there was curved text. In fact, I may revisit that before I finish up with the text. But yeah, you can adjust character spacing, so if you want to make the given text a little bit wider, putting more space in between the characters will begin to expand that out. And you might notice because that was left-aligned text, it's maintaining like the left margin, it's expanding it out to the right. It depends on how your text is aligned, exactly how that will behave. You can also go to line spacing to put space between the lines to vertically expand your text. So like something like that. And I do not believe there is any option for how you vertically space text, so it will always expand it out from the center if you do line spacing. But yeah. So lots of different options to work with text. You can, of course, always add your own images to items. Just go up to Add Image. You'll have the option to select something from your account or to upload from your computer. I believe even from Google Drive or Instagram, you can even grab images. So a lot of different options to bring an image onto your item. And once you do, of course, you work with it just as you would any other image, as we've already seen. And I should point out, for some of these items, again, by default, you will find a placeholder image. Of course, if you do not want, you obviously, I would presume, would not want the placeholder image to be on your item. And if you don't want an image at all, of course, you can just go into Customize and delete it and be done with it. But if you do want to swap out an image there, you have the option to go over to Personalize this template, Change. So find the image you want to swap out and just go to Change. Again, that will bring up all the images in your account or give you the option to upload a new one. And like that, you can go ahead and swap in a different image. Now, I will say for the placeholders, they do not put any constraints on how the image, that takes their place will behave. It will not automatically size it, for instance, to fit within the placeholder or to, go beyond it or whatnot. So it all depends on the image. Here, for instance, we see that this photo actually is covering some of the text now in comparison to how the placeholder image did. But if we just go into the design interface, we can just shrink that down and get that all fixed up. And, like I said, anything you would do for any other images, you can do there. And this item, of course, my original idea behind, setting this up was to, of course, focus on the kawaii questions, thinking people could have their individual photos and they could have this sort of, say, reminder for that, for the last day, for the meditation and all that. I hadn't really thought of putting, the photos of people of, high moral character and integrity here, but that actually, could work. You could think, well, how would someone, like this answer these questions? Or how would, how does it apply to them? How might it apply to you? That's actually something else that I never thought of to set up by default that you could do in the collection. So, again, there are quite a different things that you might, do between just, hiding and showing images, resizing, moving them around, rotating them and whatnot, expanding or, contracting them, or doing cropping or applying filters, or creating duplicates of images, or adding your own text with your own fonts and colors and whatnot, and adding your own images, and, quite a few things that you could potentially set up or accomplish. Now, before I kind of finish this up, I probably should talk about a few things in particular. So you do have flames to use on the Kinara, and you might see that they have names which suggest which like wicks they correspond to, or which candles or which mishuma they should go on. But these are not really very strict. I mean, my thinking here was, and you may notice I just zoomed in, depending on your browser or your operating system, however you might go about that. That can be helpful sometimes to do. But yeah, so you might see, looking at the individual wicks, some of them are close to being straight. Some of them do lean over to the left or right. Some perhaps more so than others. So that the names of the flames kind of give you a guideline as to which direction the wick might be leaning in that might help. But I would say as long as you don't have wick extending outside the side of a flame, something that just doesn't really look natural, you're fine. So, you can just kind of play around with these. You don't have to, have them matched up perfectly. In some cases, they may not even match up perfectly. So, yeah. And as always, by default, I pre-configured the flames so that they are on one particular Kinara. If it is an actual table setting already by default, even if the flames are not there, they will be pre-configured to appear atop the candles. Of course, so that can only be for one Kinara. If you want to swap out to a different Kinara, for instance, you would find the flames are way off, and you would have to, in that case, reposition them, perhaps even resize them a bit. And I will say that working with the flames can be one of the most tedious things there is. Getting it perfectly, you might find, for instance, like here even, you might say, well, that looks slightly small for that. Maybe you want to expand it just a little bit. Drag it down. Just try to position it as centered and about, as correct as you can. Now see, that actually looks pretty good, but perhaps you might say there's a little bit of space between the candle and the flame, which isn't appropriate. If that does happen, I would say just drag it out, just drag it back. But yeah, it's just a matter of trial and error and just, playing around with it. You can handle that. And these Kente strips up here, these work especially well for borders on items if you want to have a border. And just in case on a given image they do not appear as a border already, say maybe they're in the center, you can always center an image, by the way, by clicking right here in the center. You can move them to the edges by using these buttons around the edge here. So for instance, to move it all the way up to the top, just go ahead and click here. Although you might notice that it didn't go all the way to the end, it stopped at this blue line. Now, what these lines are, they're mentioned down here in the guidelines. Zazzle maintains that if you want to guarantee that part of an image or text or whatnot does not get cut off during printing, you should have it contained within the green dotted line on an item. They call this the safe line. My personal experience with getting items from Zazzle, and when I've seen items that other people have gotten, it seems to me that items are always printed centered and they always do appear exactly as they do in the previews online. But to be safe, technically anything that's within the blue line, the print line, should get printed. But if you really want to be safe, it is good then to make sure that you keep things that you really want within the green line. Just in case it would print a little bit off center, something that's between the red and the blue line that normally would be trimmed off, just in case that does get printed. And then as a consequence, something that should have been printed between the green and the blue line, opposite of it, gets cut. You might want to kind of watch out for that. And to that end, if you're using these for borders, if there's not, I would recommend that even if you move it overall to one side, if it stops short of the bleed line, I would recommend that maybe if there's not a lot of space to go, you just kind of adjust it and move it over. You will likely have part of it cut off, but not too much, to avoid the risk of having like a open space there. But if the item in question has, if you'd have to move it over substantially in order to do that, it might be better than to just leave it at the print line. It's up to you, and you can see how that goes. But yeah, so this has been an overview of the Gather Round Kwanzaa Creations Kit and basic editing and customizing so that you may create, items according to your own creativity, according to your own wishes, you and those of your family, perhaps of your friends. One last thing I should mention. I am aware, of course, that Kwanzaa is not a commercial holiday. It's a very personal holiday. It's a very introspective holiday, very family-oriented, value-oriented, about recognizing, and celebrating your heritage. So, the very concept of this may be something that just isn't appealing, to you. And that's perfectly understandable. I will say that in recognition of all of that, I did set my royalty rate to the minimum that Zazzle would allow me to. And that is also why, rather than just have drawn like a single image, just a single design that I put on a bunch of products, I did take the time to create all of these distinct images and to get them all set up on all these items in different default forms. And of course, these are not mass-produced items, even though they are available and can be made upon request. They are not, it's print-on-demand products. It's not mass-produced. But either way, I mean, like I said, it would be completely understandable if this does not appeal to you at all. But if any of this does appeal to you, I hope that, as Gather Round Kwanzaa Creations Kit implies, that you will gather your family around, your children, perhaps your friends, and I hope that you have, if nothing else, a fun time just kind of playing around with some of these items, just, seeing what you can do, seeing what you, might create, what you might do according to your own, creativity. Even if you decide, not to get something, just to kind of play around and have some fun. But yeah, so I will be doing 2 other videos yet. One to do a really in-depth look at what it would be like if you were creating one of these items from scratch. Of course, that's something that you would never have to do. The images are already pre-configured for you on the items, but just to really show all the ins and outs, to really get in depth with working with the design interface and the images, that's something I'm going to do yet. And I hope to do a third, much more concise video that just summarizes some specific tips and advice that you might, find useful. Yeah. So that is about it then for this video. Thank you, and perhaps I'll see you in one of the others. And for now, goodbye.